Hey guys, big news that there has been an arrest in the Long Island serial killer case, with it being Rex Heuermann, who is charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of second-degree murder, and he's suspected of murdering a 4th person. We'll see some evidence of that in this bail application that we're going to review. Of course, there are a lot more victims found on the beaches there, and he has not been tied to those, at least as far as a legal proceeding so far. So just because you catch potentially one serial killer doesn't mean that you caught all the serial killers. And we don't know whether those other people were his victims or not. There were a lot of differences in the crimes, and that can happen sometimes because of changes in the circumstances of the life of the person who's doing the killing. It can also mean that there's more than one killer. So just don't know with this case. But for the victims that he is charged with, I thought it would be good to look at what the state has laid out as their case so far. This is a developing situation, of course, because now the arrest has been made. They're executing physical search warrants, including with a storage facility. I wonder if there'd be one of those, and apparently there is one. And it'll be interesting to see if they find evidence there connecting him to these victims or other people. I have to say, if he is guilty in this case, given what we're going to see laid out in this bail application, it would be surprising if there weren't more victims. Okay, so anyway, some of this is really nasty. I'm not going to read all the nasty parts, but it'll be scrolled through so you can look at it if you want to. But the document we're going to review is called a bail application, and it's really the state laying out its case to the judge for why Heuermann should not be granted any bail. He should be held without bail. And remember, Ted Bundy kind of bailed himself out by escaping, and what did he do? He went on and killed some other people. So sometimes holding somebody in pretrial detention is the right thing to do for public safety, even though they haven't been adjudicated guilty yet. Yeah, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty, as you should be when you go into court. But before that, the court can look at the circumstances and either put bail on to make sure you'll attend court, and in some cases put pretrial detention in place, whether that's by bail or just you can't get out, period, based on the public safety aspect of this. So let's take a look at this and see what the state has to say. Heuermann stands before this court charged by the grand jury with murder in the 1st degree. So that's interesting. They did put it to the grand jury. And on 1 count, and then a 2nd count, and a 3rd count, and we'll see these as it applies to individual victims as we go through this. Murder in the 2nd degree. And same victims there. So they're covering both potentials there. Hard to believe it's not 1st degree, whoever did do it, right? I mean, come on. Anyway, as described below, based on the serious, heinous nature of these serial murders, the planning and forethought that went into these crimes, the strength of the people's case, the length of incarceration the defendant faces upon conviction, the extended period of time that this defendant was able to avoid apprehension, recent searches for sadistic materials, child assault materials, images of the victims and their relatives, counter surveillance conducted online as to his criminal investigation, using fictitious names, burner emails, and cell phone accounts, access to and history of possessing firearms, the only means to ensure his return to court is to remand him without bail. So here they're not actually talking about the public safety aspect so much as the need to return him to bail. And I think that may be something to do with New York law, because they have some weird bail laws up there these days that are not oriented towards public safety, to put it mildly. Okay. This whole anti-bail movement, and bail sometimes being an unnecessary expense for lower level crimes that just hits poor people hard, and reforming that, which I think a lot of people could get on board with if you're not really a flight risk, has been co-opted to help a lot of violent people avoid any pretrial detention. And of course, there are a lot of innocent victims paying for that. But that's the way things work these days in society, is a reasonable compromise that might be out there is co-opted in favor of some kind of extreme position. At any rate, would this guy come back to court if you let him out on bail? I don't know that, but I think it's also fair to say he's an extreme danger to the public. But the state says here, the only way to ensure his return to court is to remand him without bail. Discovery of the victims. December 11th, 2010, there was an officer conducting a training exercise with a dog, and they located a set of human remains at Gilgo Beach, New York. They were later identified to be those of Melissa Barthelemy. 2 days later, they continued the search, and on that date, they found 3 more sets of human remains within a quarter mile of the first discovery. So this beach, pretty nasty situation here of murder victims being dumped there. And they were identified as Maureen Brainard-Barnes, and he's not charged with her murder at present, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. Now, I'm not sure why he's not charged with her murder currently, since they seem to suspect him so greatly of it. Could be a legal strategy situation, and it could be just a situation with evidence at this point. We'll see. The cause of death of all 4 women was determined to be homicidal violence. And here's a map they put up. Let that set up there for a second so you can kind of see. So an interesting situation there that they were all placed so closely together. The investigations into these deaths were linked, as in addition to other factors, the victims each appeared to have been placed in close proximity to one another, 22 to 33 feet from the edge of the parkway. That's really close, right? That's really close. It's 10 yards off of the side of the road is as far as these people really were. So that didn't go far into the woods there. And it is a danger, I suppose, to have your car on the side of the road but so long while you're disposing of a body. Plus, I think the terrain was pretty rough in terms of being marshy. All petite females, 22 to 27, working as sex workers. They had missing clothing and personal items, being killed by homicide. All had contact shortly before their disappearance with a person using a burner cell phone. And so here we got the footnote about Brainard-Barnes. He's not yet charged with any crimes about her, but he's the prime suspect in her death. And the investigation is continuing and is expected to be resolved soon. There's substantial evidence of his involvement in the disappearance and death of her. Closely fits the modus operandi of the defendant in relation to the deaths of the other 3 women. And that's an issue for some of these other cases that are not part of this charge or mentioned here, is that things are different in how those people were dealt with when they were either killed, but especially when they were disposed of. So the bail application contains descriptions of that evidence and demonstrates the strength of the people's case as currently charged. So 2 of the cell phones of victims were used by the killer after their deaths. And you'll hear more about that. But, he would call a family and taunt them. Just absolutely evil. I mean, there are some cases where somebody murders somebody maybe to cover up the fact that they committed some other crime, or they were mad at the person, or maybe they just lost control of their mind at that point. None of that's excusable. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there's an extra level of evil when you take the person who you murdered, their cell phone, and you start calling, say, the younger sister and abusing her and torturing her the best you possibly can. I mean, this guy was constantly obsessed with the murders that he had committed and reliving that and getting further enjoyment out of it. That's why I wonder whether it's really possible that he only killed these 4 people. And as the state's case will show, this was not something he left behind in the past. They didn't catch this guy and he had moved on with his life. He was doing many of the same things that he had been doing at the time he murdered these people. He was still doing it. But in this case, the 4 victims were found similarly positioned, bound in a similar fashion by belts or tape, and 3 of them, of the 4, were wrapped in burlap-type material. So recent investigation, they rebooted this puppy, it says, in January 2022, and a comprehensive review of every item of evidence was done. 2 months into it, the renewed joint investigation, the comprehensive review, led to the discovery of a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche registered to the defendant at the time of the murders. And this was significant because a witness to the disappearance of Amber Costello identified that. According to, that's a kind of a rare truck because it's dumb, and he had it. And I guess they never put all these pieces together, but this newly formed task force, rejuvenated or whatever, reviewed the evidence and found this. And this, this leads them, because they knew kind of where these calls were coming from in terms of a geographic area. So you have that narrowed down, and then you find who owns an odd truck like this that's black, and you go to work, and they did. That led to a comprehensive investigation of the defendant, which consisted of over 300 subpoenas, search warrants, and other legal processes to obtain evidence. So doing a lot of work. So part of this evidence was cell phone billing records and other things related to cell phones, in terms of the burner cell phones used to arrange the meetings with 3 of the 4 victims, the taunting calls made to a relative of Miss Barthelemy, call made by a detective to her cell phone while looking into her disappearance, and calls checking voicemail on Brainard-Barnes' cell phone after her disappearance. This dude lived in Massapequa Park, where the victims were believed to have disappeared from, and he worked in Midtown Manhattan, in the vicinity where the taunting calls were made to the sister. Now, when you see in the vicinity and near and all that, yeah, right, that none of that establishes anything beyond a reasonable doubt, but you're looking for the totality of the evidence and not any individual piece. You look at the whole picture and see whether it's compelling or not. If this guy lived in Nevada and the calls were coming from Midtown Manhattan, it would be a different picture, right? But here you're starting to see, well, okay, he was there. Now, that doesn't mean it's him, but it starts to paint this picture, an outline of it. He's believed to be the person who used to burn her cell phones, as they're going to explain below, to communicate with each of the 4 victims prior to their disappearance. And that he's the person who used Brainard-Barnes' cell phone and Barthelemy's cell phone after their deaths. All right, so the disappearance and murder of Maureen. She was last seen July 9th, 2007 in New York City. It's kind of interesting. These 4 cases, I think, are around mid to late summer. At that time, she was believed to be working as a prostitute, and her cell phone was contacted by a burner cell phone. 16 interactions between the burner phone and hers before she disappeared. Last time they knew where her phone was, it was in Midtown Manhattan, and then no further activity until July 12th. Then there were outbound calls made from her cell phone, checking her voicemail. Disappearance and murder of Melissa, last seen on July 10th, 2009, so a couple of years later. And sometimes you see these serial killers, they'll make this, builds up the pressure, the fantasy, the obsession builds up, then they kill somebody, and in some cases, that's enough for quite a while. And then eventually it starts to recharge again, like a volcano going to go off again. So here's a case 2 years later. Maybe he didn't kill anybody in the interim. Who knows? But that's kind of sometimes how it works. And he wants to do the same thing again. He really liked it, enjoyed it. Maybe he was worried about getting caught. I don't think he ever felt sorry for it. But he decides, I'm going to do it again. So he contacts her by a burner cell phone. And let's see. And then her cell phone was also used after her disappearance. Check her voicemail. 2 more calls. And then the taunting calls occurred. And you see several of those here, right? And he actually talked with someone in the home. I think at one point a sister, maybe a mother or whatever too, but at least the sister. And said, yeah, I did these things to her. And he wanted to instill fear, and also the fear they would have, and the horror of receiving his communication was part of what jazzed this dude up, right? Who else is he going to talk to about it and get the same kind of feeling? So that's what he did. That has happened before too, of course. Disappearance and murder of Megan, that is on June 6, 2010. So, roughly a year later. Same situation, burner phone that had been activated that day. And she was captured on a Holiday Inn surveillance. I think that's on the internet to see. Holiday Inn camera catches her for the last time. And disappearance of Amber, September 2010. So you have a period of time where there's 2 years maybe between murders, and then 1 year, and now they're right on top of each other. So what's happening here? That's a terrible situation, and it makes it difficult for me to believe that 4 is the final number, considering he was never caught and he didn't bury this piece of himself, as you're going to see. All right, same kind of thing. Burner cell phone, blah, blah, blah. These are all proximities of the cell phone, and you can take it that the cell phone was in irrelevant locations. Those are not exact locations, but just relevant and consistent with what the story is the state is trying to tell. But this one was a little different here, because I think she's the one. Yes. So she had a situation where the John would come to her location. Then a dude would show up and pretend to be the outraged boyfriend and break this whole thing up. And then they would have the money as the John flees the situation. And apparently it kind of occurred to some degree. But this dude, the defendant, is really big and was described as an ogre. Now, there was a witness, though, who noticed, because, she wasn't killed at this point, and people saw some of this interaction. They noticed this first generation Chevrolet Avalanche parked in the driveway of the residence. And apparently he said, I'm just her friend. I'll give her a call. And he takes off. They talk about how the ogre and the other description of the guy is consistent with what he really is like. That was not nice to do. He later sends to her, and he wants a credit for next time. So apparently he said, yeah, let's get back together, but I'm not doing it at your house because I'm not falling for that scheme anymore. And this is terrible, because what he was able to do was cajole these women for what, they're doing dangerous work, dangerous things. And sometimes they had at least a little bit of a safety margin in terms of maybe having a driver, or they would control to some degree where it was, or have a communication device. And he was able pretty much to eliminate those factors. And he did it here. He was able to pick her up, and I don't even think she left her cell phone behind, and that's it. Nobody saw her again. Now, the mistake here, of course, was he had an initial interaction with her where his vehicle was seen, and that ultimately, although it took a long time, the police say is what sparked the lead toward him. Now, they do note his wife was out of New York for the disappearance of 3 of these 4 victims that they're talking about, at least the 3 charged. And they're tracking, cell phones and flights or whatever to show his wife was gone. So that would give him some time to do this stuff. And where did he do it and all that? I don't know all of that for sure. It does turn out that he had a storage shed for some period of time. So a storage site, off-site, away from his home. That may turn out to be very relevant. But his wife was away when these things happen. And of course, you see absolute scum on social media assume that when somebody like this is arrested, serial killers often have a superficial normal life. Sometimes they have a wife, sometimes they have kids, and then you're like, oh, the wife had to know, or the kids had to know, or whatever. That's pretty vile, right? That's vile. If you don't know that, why would you say something like that? In a case like this, the family is likely a victim too. They are likely a victim too, and dealing with the horror of this situation. So I'm assuming that's the case here. I don't know it either way, but I definitely would not assume anything bad about his family at this point. And the police even say, look, she was gone when this stuff happened. Now they talk about his billing records. And he owned this architectural business. Everybody knows that now. Some of the records are really old. I couldn't find them. I'm just going to scroll through this some, because this is really about showing cell phones that he owned or was associated with being in the proximity of relevant times and events related to these murders. They don't show for certain, of course, that he did it, but it's all part of building this picture that they're trying to do. And here they show, where a victim's phone was likely located at the time it was used and where his office was. It's illuminating. It's not conclusive. Same thing with the burner stuff and all that. I'll pause to show the maps, but you kind of get the idea. They put a lot of this information in there. So I'm going to move through it. So this video isn't but so long, but you can pause the stuff to read it if you want. Here we go. All these cell phones and what he was calling and what he was doing. Then he took off to Iceland himself for a little bit. I think his second wife was from there, or at least of that heritage. And all this activity stops. And when he comes back, the very next day, one of the victim's phone is used again. So that looks pretty bad. If you're not capable of understanding how that looks bad, okay. If you think that means he's certainly guilty, that's a stretch. But if you don't understand how this starts to be relevant, I get it. Analysis isn't for everyone. All right, let's see here. More about the cell phones and proximity and use time and all that. Additional burner phones. This gets to be, I think, a little more relevant here, so we'll slow down and look at this a little bit. Over the course of the comprehensive investigation, investigators located a number of online accounts and burner cell phones linked to the defendant, but which were held by him in fictitious names and used for illicit activities. Now, he's not the only one, of course, who does things like this, and not everyone who does it is a serial killer, but this is all part of the picture. So he got on Tinder, online dating, and all that to find dates or hookups. So I suppose maybe on there you can find sex workers and stuff, apparently, because I think that's what he was up to. So he used a name Andy because that's his middle name, and to a burner phone, a fictitious name of Andrew Roberts, and an AOL account. That ought to be a red flag right there. People, come on. AOL. And then another thing here. Let's see. He was using those accounts to access this Tinder stuff. And I think they actually caught his main cell phone accessing the Tinder junk, and then some of these burner phones too. 2 additional burner phones. This guy was getting a burner phone all the time. And they say that these more recent burner phones were located in the same area as the burner phones used to contact the victims. Again, that's of limited probative value, but not no probative value. Legal process served. Another burner or junk email account. Almost all email accounts are junk. T-Hawk. I guess that's what he means there. I don't know. Thomas Hawk. Yes. Okay. Thomas Hawk. And here I'm going to bring this back up before I scroll pretty quickly through this because he's nasty. He conducted thousands of searches related to sex workers, sadistic, torture-related porn, and child assault. Okay, so he's a serial killer killing, so far as we know, adult people, but that was not the limit of his interest as he went on to the internet trying to find things that would excite him. And I'm going to just move through this pretty quickly because I'm not going to read this stuff, but he's absolutely vile. And if the police saw this, they were rightly alarmed that this dude was not done having the capacity to hurt and kill people, not if that's what he's interested in. I'm pretty libertarian in terms of thinking what people can do, but I'm sorry. You can go back up there and look at that stuff if you want to. Nah, I don't buy it. And I get, these cases are horrible, and when you start mixing kids in with it, and then I think it's about as bad as it possibly can be. Because the criminals are all different, and not every serial killer is, for example, a pedophile, but this dude appears to have thought long and hard about the harm of children that could be inflicted and how to watch it. And that's disgusting. So that's what I think about this guy. They also said, now remember, they're just showing some searches related to try and make sure he doesn't get out on bail, which would be an absolute travesty. Who knows what the extent of the depravity is. And the searches resulted in things, and they didn't bother to list those here, which I appreciate that. But the level of vile evil that this guy was engaged in is not fully set out in this document, thankfully. All right, so he did in excess of 200 searches from March to June 2023. So that's a lot in a short period of time related to active and known serial killers, specifically the disappearance and murders of the people that he's believed to have been involved in. Why could police not trace the calls made by the Long Island serial killer? Why hasn't he been caught? Long Island serial killer, killer, update, FBI, active serial killer, so forth and so on. Now you'll see in here, he names some of the victims. What's interesting about this is he's not naming victims that he's not associated with. In this case of 4 people that were found close together, it does make me wonder whether there was another serial killer out there, or and still is potentially. There are not just one. They also searched for podcasts and documentaries regarding the investigation and viewed hundreds of images depicting the murdered victims and members of their immediate families. So remember, he liked inflicting pain on them too, from a distance. And here's some of what he was looking at in his searches that generated those results. So they got the search warrant on his Springfield Man 9 AOL account. And he took selfies to solicit and arrange for activity inconsistent with marital vows. And it was linked to his fictitious email account and a burner cell phone. Nice. So here he is. That's a prize there, ladies and gentlemen. That's a real prize. I can see maybe he should even be showing some money in that, because that's really what you're going for when you click on that, I think. And he knew that. And in some cases, I think if you look back at this, he offered these girls higher than normal amounts of money. And that was part of how he was able to tempt them away from the meager safety net that they sometimes did have. Just evil. Here he is purchasing burner phones. Cool. All right. Yeah, that's totally legit. Cool. Here's your cash for this burner phone. I'm wearing sunglasses, but he didn't disguise himself very well. Then they ended up finding another email address. So this guy's got lots of things where he was sending pictures of one of the prostitutes from one of his bogus email accounts to another. So if she's alive, she dodged a bullet. I think many women probably did from this guy. And they talk a little bit about how they were able to connect some of these bogus email addresses and burner phones together. And when he accepted terms of service, I think they were tying some of it to his house. Yeah, his home address. And he was also watching the police news site to see what they were finding out. They tied an IP address that visited there to the same IP address that was used to book flights for him and his wife. A clear pattern, they say, where he used burner phones and burner junk email addresses to contact prostitutes, conducting extensive searches related to that, and violent and sadistic and child-harming things, and watch out for what authorities were doing about his crimes. In other words, he didn't want to get caught, and it's one of the reasons why they say that he doesn't need bail, because he's been so elusive on purpose. He wanted to conceal his true identity, conceal his criminal activity, unlawfully proposition sex workers, and monitor investigation of his crimes. Yeah, I think that's a fair summary of just what they showed, which could have been worse. So now we get into a little bit of the evidence about the crimes. DNA analysis of the hairs recovered from the examination of the victims' bodies. Each, of course, were examined, and I think they used their own crime lab, but for DNA, some outside crime labs, which is not uncommon. If you want to imagine that means that the DNA is meaningless, you go right ahead, but it's not what it means. But, however, I have to say the DNA evidence, as you'll see in this case, is not as tight as some of the DNA evidence that you'll see in other cases. That's just how it is sometimes. Again, you have to look at the total picture. DNA evidence is typically circumstantial anyway. I continue to see people not understand that, but it's just one piece of the circumstantial chain, and you have to look at the rest of it as you decide whether this guy did it or not. So the first victim they talk about is Maureen, and she was restrained by 3 leather belts. During the examination of that, they found a female human hair, and they were able to determine that it corresponded to a Caucasian head hair fragment. It wasn't suitable for nuclear DNA profiling at the time, but it was subsequently submitted for further DNA analysis, and they'll talk about that later. Megan is bound by clear or white duct tape. 2 female human hairs were recovered, and they were subsequently submitted for further DNA analysis. So that's 2 victims where they found female hair not belonging to the victim on them. Amber, she was bound by clear or white duct tape. Female human hair was found on her, on a piece of tape inside of the burlap wrapping in the vicinity of her head. Unsuitable at the time for further DNA testing, subsequently submitted. So we got the 3 there. Yeah, one of those is not who he's charged with, but 3 of the 4 victims that he suspected him had these female hairs on them. So they now refer to them collectively as the female hairs recovered on the 3 victims. They were sent to outside forensic laboratory number 1. And they determined that they were able to narrow down who this was, at least to some group, to some slightly more limited group, or maybe greatly more limited, depending on how you want to look at it. Then they go and they get 11 bottles from a trash receptacle of the in front of the residence of the defendant, which they can do. They took swabs from the bottles and sent that to the lab. Based on that, they were able to conclude that one of the DNA profiles generated from the aforementioned bottles taken from his residence indicated a female belonging to the same mitochondrial haplogroup, K1C2. And that was the same as what was found on the victims. So that's not an individual match at that point. That's a group match. And then they said they were able to compare them to previously tested female hair samples recovered on Waterman. So I guess they got a better example there. And that indicated the two belonged to the same individual or someone closely related. So they, it's varying degrees of how good this DNA profile is that they are working with from the victims. And they think that's his wife. And they'll explain why in a second. Forensic laboratory number 2. And they say that a report concluding that the DNA, they issued a report concluding that the DNA sample from the female recovered from the bottles outside his residence, that's his wife, and the female hair on Costello indicated they are the same at all compared positions common to and between samples. And that would exclude 99.98% of the North American population from the female hair. So if you were picking out random people, you'd have a 99.98% chance of exclusion, which means a 0.02% chance that somebody would match into this. Now, sometimes you see the odds are a lot higher that it's, that you'd be excluded. So it depends on the nature of the profile that you get and how good it is and stuff like that, what the odds are. So, 99.98%, is that enough for you to say for sure or just highly probably? It's somewhere in there, right? It's not as great as some DNA evidence you see and not as bad as some others. And they talk about their confidence level and how they do it and why it has those kind of limits on it. And then they compared the profile with the DNA sample to Waterman. And at that situation, they come up to the odds of 99.69%. So on two different people, high odds that you would be excluded from this if you were randomly selected, and yet she is not excluded. So they're saying that 99.98% of the North American population can be excluded from the female hair on Costello, 99.69% on Waterman. But it's significant that the wife cannot be excluded. So again, they're doing the right thing here. They're not saying well, this is a match to her. They're talking about odds of exclusion. It's a piece of circumstantial evidence, and they're able to put a probability on it. Now, they do note that she was gone, so they say as such, it's likely that the burlap tape, vehicles, and other instrumentalities utilized in furtherance of the murders came from the residence where his wife also resides or was transferred from his clothing. That makes sense. Male hair linked to him. Okay, now we're getting somewhere else, which is also good for the investigation. During the examination of the skeletal remains of Waterman and the burlap materials, they recovered a male hair from the bottom of the burlap. And it's unsuitable for DNA at that time. In 2020, they were able to generate a DNA profile from the hair. And they get, again, a group here that they think it belongs to. Following the discovery of the avalanche, they were able to recover this pizza that he was eating. The miracle was, I guess, he didn't eat all of it, although maybe they could get something outside the box, but that's what he left behind. They sent that off to the crime lab and matched it to the hair, as it says here, the male hair. And they come up with a situation where you'd be 99.96% likely to exclude a male from this if you were just picking random people. So he's in the 0.04%. So his wife is highly likely to be the person who left the DNA, the hair there, although she didn't do it, it was going to come from him. Highly likely there based on the exclusion statistics. And he's also in that box. So what are the odds that you pick random people and both of these people are not excluded? It starts getting taller, right? It starts looking worse. So 99.96% of the North American population can be excluded. Significant that he cannot be excluded. And it is significant, particularly also when you take that with his wife, because now you're facing a long odds in both situations, and long odds against long odds is even longer odds. So they arrested him July 13th. And he had on his person a burner cell phone that was linked to the Thomas Hawk email account that did all the disgusting searches. He faces life without parole. Remand without bail is appropriate. Not really happy with how they have to analyze this, but let's do it because we're almost at the end. Based on the serious, heinous nature of the offenses, yada, yada, he faces life without parole. The extreme measures he took to attempt to avoid apprehension for an extended period of time, the recent sadistic and child harm searches, fictitious names, burner accounts, counter surveillance, only The only means to ensure his return to court is to remand the defendant without bail. Notice, nowhere mentioned in this, and this is not the district attorney's fault, is there concern for public safety. So that's your policy situation these days in some areas of the country, that public safety is no factor. So that sucks. But anyway, this is the state's case for why he should be held without bail. To me, it's quite compelling, and you're welcome to have your own opinion on that. And we'll see as this case develops. Again, they found a storage area that he had, and that might prove to be illuminating, but they have a lot on this guy as it is. Unfortunately, he may not be the only serial killer at work there, and that he may not be responsible for all the deaths. And in that case, they still have work to do. But congratulations to law enforcement for finally making a big movement in this case to bring some justice to it. That's it. Thanks. Bye.